Hey, what's going on, guys? It's your boy Tillman with another Tillman's Take. So what I want to do is I want to break down a recent video that comes to us out of New York, and it involves officers doing some enforcement for social distancing. Now, before we actually get to the video, I want to talk about social distancing and where we're at right now as a country as it involves law enforcement in the community. Right now, we're kind of at a rock and a hard place because there's a lot of different cities and states that are doing different practices in other different states. And so as you look at law enforcement, we're kind of in the middle. You got some governors that say, hey, we're going to enforce it. Some are saying you're not. And then you have local municipalities saying, hey, we're going to enforce it. Some are saying we're not. And so there kind of needs to be a clear delineation of what people are doing and what law enforcement is to do and what they're not to do. I guess what it seems like in New York, it sounds like they're enforcing these social distancing practices, and that kind of leads us to the video that we have today. So let's watch and see what takes place after these officers are enforcing social distancing practices.
Move the fuck back. What you flexing for? Don't flex. You got lost up too. See? Look. He ain't even do nothing. He ain't even do nothing. He ain't even do nothing. Look. He ain't even do nothing. He ain't even do nothing. He's pussy. That nigga's pussy. That nigga's pussy. Yo. I got all that. He got all that.
So as we watch that video, you can see things escalated quite quickly in that situation. Now, I do want to tell you that as an officer, I've been in situations like these myself. I've been put in situations where we had a few people fighting at a football game, and literally we had the whole crowd surround us. People with cameras out, people cussing at us, you name it. It was a dangerous situation because we had about 6 or 7 officers surrounded by a crowd of about 50 to 100 people. It was a crazy situation. However, what we did in that situation was we had all the officers surround the officers that were trying to take the 2 people into custody, almost creating a circle-like illusion so that way nobody crossed that threshold. And if somebody did cross that threshold, officers were willing to use force to effect that arrest, overcome the resistance, or prevent an escape. That's kind of what should have happened in this situation specifically. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. What happened was you have officers that are trying to take somebody into custody, and you have another officer there that's kind of looking out into the crowd and seeing that there's some civilians out there cussing at him, yelling all these obscenities and everything like that. As that happens, that officer starts to approach and walk up on that civilian. And as he's doing so, he takes his taser out of his holster. And what he does is he conducts a spark test. What a spark test is, you pull the trigger on the taser, you take the cartridge off, and it kind of gives that arcing effect. And what it's supposed to do is give the psychological illusion to that person on the other end, like, hey, I don't want to be tased at all, because they see the electricity created in that little arc. And so that is a common practice depending on what agency you are across the United States. It's also common in what we call mobile field force. If we're out there doing some type of damage control or crowd control, we will spark test our tasers so that way people know, like, hey, you could be tased if you don't listen to what we're doing. So it seems like that's what the officer is attempting to do with this civilian. Where he goes wrong is he starts to continue to advance on that civilian. It is not our job as officers to create exigent circumstances that are now going to cause us to use a level of force. And so I think the officer was wrong in this situation because he advances towards he advances towards a civilian, creating a situation where now he has to use force. I am going to tell you that officers will undoubtedly most likely use force in any situation where a civilian starts to pose or starts to take a fighting stance or starts to flex towards an officer. And if that officer perceives that that civilian is going to try to swing on that officer, an officer is probably going to utilize force. And that's what it kind of seems like towards the end of this video is that civilian did take some type of fighting stance towards the officer, but it's also because that officer was challenging him. That officer was walking towards him. That officer is yelling and cussing back at him. That officer is also flexing on the civilian civilian. So as officers, we shouldn't be out there creating an exigent circumstance where now we put ourselves in a situation where now we have to use force on somebody. And that's why I think he's wrong, because, hey, look, if that officer would have stood by where his other officer is at trying to take that person into custody and told people, hey, look, if you cross this line, if you cross this threshold, force may be used against you, that's a different story. Had that civilian walked up on him, had that civilian passed that threshold that officer created in his mind, then you have a different story, and that officer would have been completely justified in using this level of force. However, that officer instead in this situation advanced towards the civilian, created the exigent circumstance. He's cussing at the civilian, taking that flex against the civilian, and now you got the two guys that start to fight, or actually more so the officer punching the guy in the face and then taking him into custody. So I think the officer was wrong in this situation. We have to maintain a level of composure as officers. I've talked about de-escalation before, and this would have been a perfect situation to de-escalate a situation. Stay where you're at, stay where your other officers are at, so that way you keep them safe so nobody advances on them, and try to bring your voice down so that way hopefully you can de-escalate the civilians on hand. There's been so many times I was in a situation recently where we were trying to take some guys into custody, and you had a whole bunch of people come up on us with cameras out, cussing at us. But the one thing that we didn't do in the situation is we didn't advance on them. We stood by where our officers were at, so that way we can make sure nobody compromises their safety as we're trying to take them into custody, and letting everybody know, like, hey, look, as long as you don't cross this threshold, force will not be used against you. If you do cross this threshold, force is going to be used against you. So as officers, we got to maintain a level of composure. It didn't seem like that was the case in this situation. And unfortunately, for me, I think the officer was out of line. Yes, de-escalation does take two sides. It does take the officer and it does take the civilians. But at the end of the day, as officers, we have a level of expectation to make sure that we can maintain our composure even when the civilians don't. Thanks again. That's my 10-1 take for today. God bless.